Príjemné popoludnie po 5-krát. A máme pred sebou taký kratší blok, ale o mnoho zaujímavejší. Pretože sme sa rozhodli po 7 rokoch Hieronymových dní zavolať medzi nás aj výrobcov softvéru. Oslovili sme firmu memoQ, ktorá vlastne vyrába softvér, s ktorým pracujeme aj tu na fakulte, a prijali toto pozvanie, takže v skratke nám predstavia svoj CAT nástroj a jeho nové trendy. A zajtra sa uskutočnia aj 2 workshopy, ktoré tu budeme mať, ešte možno nejaké 1-2 miesta tam sú, tak sa prihláste, ak máte záujem. Bude to workshop pre začiatočníkov ráno a potom o 10:30 workshop pre pokročilých pri práci s memoQ. Táto prezentácia bude v angličtine. And I'll just do the short introduction in English. Peter Reynolds came from memoQ, which used to be, or is, a Hungarian company, but Peter flew in from Warsaw, and he is Irish, so you can see how global this company has become. And I have to say that I personally use memoQ, and I'm really fond of it, and I'm also very thankful for the fact that memoQ has been very open and very active in supporting education. We have licenses for students for free. We don't have to pay for them, and we are benefiting from a very generous offer from memoQ in terms of the education support that we get. So I'm really glad that we have a chance to, and that you have a chance to present your software and the newest possibilities that it opens for translators.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to especially thank the sign language interpreters, because I think this is going to be difficult for them. As you know, I'm speaking English, they're signing in Slovakian, I think. I work in a company called memoQ. Before that, I've worked in various companies, but the last 20 years involved in the translation industry. I've worked in some of the big translation companies like Berlitz, Bown, Linebridge. I've worked for a company called Idiom, which has now been bought by STL, and for the last 12 years I've worked for memoQ. As well as my involvement with translation technology, I'm also involved with standards. I was one of the people that came up with the original idea for XLIF, and I'm the convener of the working group that deals with translation at ISO. What I'm going to talk to you today is about some of the trends in the translation industry. I'm going to show you a model of how I see the translation industry, which hopefully will make sense to you and give you an idea of why certain people say certain things and so on. I'm then going to start looking at memoQ and start looking at augmented translation, followed by looking at some of the technologies like MT, voice recognition, leveraging translation memories, audio visual translation, and finally look at quality assurance. And after that, I hope we'll have time for questions. So I'll start by looking at the translation industry. And in this matrix, if you can see this, it's got 2 axes. One is value and the other is quantity. And what I've done is divided up, as I see it, the different parts of the translation industry based on these 2 axes. And in the first one, where it's low quantity and low value, essentially there's no money to pay anybody to translate this, so it's done for free, it's crowdsourced. This can be interesting because sometimes the projects that are happening here end up somewhere else. LinkedIn famously started as a crowdsourced translation project. I think Wikipedia is still a crowdsourced translation project, but sometimes they move from there into another sector. And also sometimes people in here, because they're completely new, they don't know what they're doing essentially, they figure out new ways to do it, and sometimes that's interesting. If we go above them to where it's low volume, but high quantity. What I'm talking about here is the big bulk translation projects where, for example, Microsoft or Oracle are translating huge user manuals that nobody reads in the original language, so it's very unlikely that they'll be read in the translated language. And sometimes they're translating them because it's a legal requirement. in many countries of Central Europe, it's a legal requirement if you want certain sort of contracts to have all the manuals translated in the local language. And you'll find that engineers and the people using it want to read the original because they want to make sure that what they have is perfect, but it's been translated. And in this sector, in the sector where the big technology companies are using phenomenal amounts of quantity of text, it's all automated. What people do in here is maybe quality assurance, but essentially it's machine translated and it's done through an automated process. And that's not likely to change. From our perspective, what memoQ do is we provide tools for people that do premium translation. And this market here would be where I would put companies like life science companies. Games localization is a huge market, and for us it's a very, very important market. And in there, you definitely need people, because a machine will get the cultural references wrong if somebody isn't looking at it to make sure that what's been translated is done correctly, and you've got a problem. Audio-visual translation has gone from being a relatively small sector to being a phenomenal one. Probably it could even be one of the biggest sectors at this stage. And again, it's very important that even if machine translation is used, that a professional translator is deciding on what happens to it. And this sector is quite important for that, because there's still a high volume of words and a high quality of words. Project management becomes very important here. They do want to automate everything they can, but they want people to confirm that the translation is right. Anything that can happen to speed up the translation process is welcome, because essentially it's very competitive. But there has to be somebody there checking it. And the final sector is a sector that I would call translator-centric sector. This is where there is a smaller volume, but it's high quality, highly valued words. Like, for example, if in one of these technology companies that has got pure MT process, if their chief executive wants to write a letter to the president of China to try to get an appointment for as part of some trade show or something like that, they don't do machine translation. They get the best translator they can find, and she or he does it. There's a lady that talks an awful lot about translation called Chris Durbin, who's a French-American translator living in France. And what she does in order to get business is she looks through the Financial Times and she spots French companies who are thinking of doing business in America, thinking of, say, putting an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. And she'll contact the chief financial officer, the CEO, and will try her best to be at that level. And this, again, it's dominated by high-powered translators when it's small quantities, but they're very valuable words. So I'm going to go on and talk about augmented translation. This is an idea, the essential idea here is that you get a set of tools and a set of tools that are personalized, and put the translator at the center of the technology in the translation project. But essentially it's to make the translator more powerful and to get them to get everything they want. You've all heard of augmented reality, when people wander around looking for Pokemon, whatever, and things. Well, what we're talking about here is the same idea with translation. And the Common Sense Advisory, which are a research group based in Boston in the United States, they've come up with this model that they describe around augmented translation. And even at this stage, everything is moving so fast that the model that we've got here is probably out of date. And there are new things, some of the things that they describe as being very important have almost become old technologies that people are no longer using. These are the various components that I think are in augmented translation. The technology, artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is a funny term because what people are talking about when they mention artificial intelligence is not intelligence in our sense. It's basically a machine doing spotting patterns and being able to figure out what's happening. And where that becomes very important is if the translator keeps on doing certain things as part of their work, artificial intelligence can be used to optimize that. Integration with other systems are, again, something that's quite important. The augmented translation environment needs the translator to get everything without feeling they have to do anything to get it. It has to be something that happens without them having to worry about it. And also the tools need to be personalized. The right tool for one person is not necessarily the right tool for another, and there's no reason why the tools can't be personalized to match the user needs. And this shows some of the things that we in memoQ think we add as part of augmented translation. And I won't talk about this too much because in this presentation I'm allowed to talk about some of these things elsewhere, so I will do that. And you just had a presentation on post-editing and machine translation. I'm going to quickly talk about that and start by mentioning the history of machine translation because it's been around for over 60 years, which is quite unusual. Even my apologies for this. Technologies like translation memory came from a professor in Brigham Young University in the United States telling his students that machine translation is all very well, but nobody's ever found anything useful for it. Nobody's ever done anything practical for it. Have you got any ideas? And they came up with the idea of having a much simpler technology where they just match segments that translators previously used. And translation memory then came from that. It didn't happen the other way around, that machine translation comes from translation memory. It's translation memory that came from machine translation. And you can see here how things progressed. And essentially, it's like buses. You wait for a bus for an hour and then 3 comes along at once. What has happened with translation memory over the last 10 years is that a whole pile of different technologies have come along. About 10 or so years ago, the European Union financed a project called MOSES. And what this was a phrase-based statistical engine. But because it was free, and because the European Union made sure that all the documentation around it were published, it meant that almost anyone could create their own machine translation engine. And that had quite a fantastic effect because the phrase-based statistical engines were much, much better than what had happened before them. I'm going to talk about URL-MT in a minute, but there's other examples where technology has come in with machine translation. It's come in quick and been gone. About 2 or 3 years ago, they were talking about adaptive MT, where essentially what would happen is that as a translator typed, the machine translation engine would adapt to that and come up with suggestions. And this looked like being a really interesting technology, but it's already gone because neural machine translation likes the full sentence, and almost everything we're seeing now is neural machine translation. And what neural translation is, it's based on an artificial intelligence technology that has been around an awful long time. Again, like machine translation, the basis for this has been around for, I think since the 1960s, they've been talking about neural networks. But what they've done here is they've used this technology to come up with the ability to to machine translate, and it appears that it's doing very well. People say that neural networks are doing much better translation through machines than we've ever seen. The problem is that they also make mistakes. And one of the issues with neural machine translation is that when it makes a mistake, you don't notice because it looks good. So for example, the model that people had many years ago about having a translation go through machine translation and then be post-edited doesn't make a lot of sense with neural machine translation, because you'll look at the output text and you'll think, oh, it looks perfect. The other thing that neural machine translation does that's a problem is it omits stuff. If it doesn't know what the translation is, it just skips it. And again, it looks like it should be right. If you don't see the original, you don't know that there's a problem. And potentially, that's an issue. One of the interesting companies that are doing this is a German company called DeepL. And this company is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that they're doing neural machine translation slightly different. Within artificial intelligence, they've got different levels of artificial intelligence. They've got where you use a neural network would probably be level 1, but then the next level beyond that is where you have what they call deep learning. And what DeepL are doing is using that technology for machine translation. And they're coming up with quite good results. When they first introduced their engine, Google had a major problem, because for the German to English translation, machine translation, DeepL proved to be much, much better than Google. And the Google engineers were all brought in and asked to explain this, because they'd spent billions on machine translation, and they wanted a reason why this small German startup could beat them at it. The other thing that's quite interesting with DeepL is that translators, particularly in Germany and Poland, seem to like them. And that could be that, for those particular languages, they're very good. One of the other things is that the company has credibility, because it was involved in Lingui, the search, I suppose the concordant search engine. And they're doing quite clever things. And it's the only engine that I've heard translators argue quite, that this is coming quite close to what people do. But bear in mind that every time somebody tells you that machine translation is coming close to what people can do, they usually have a quote like it's 95% parity. 95% parity, that means every 20 words there's a mistake. Do you know any translators still working who have a mistake every 20 words? Because I don't think that is acceptable from a person. The other thing that's happening with machine translation that's quite interesting is where the research is happening. Because when in the 1950s, 1960s, and so on, the research was funded by Cold War ideas. The research in America was to fund projects that were translating from Russian to English, so that they could figure out, what was happening as part of the their Cold War effort. And they weren't that particularly successful. The universities were another great source of research in machine translation. Students of Noam Chomsky were essentially a group of people that did an awful lot of work in MIT and other universities. And again, it was quite interesting, because when research is done at a university, it's usually different research in each university, and they publish it. What is happening now is that there is billions of euro, dollars, or whatever of research being done, and it's happening in companies. Alibaba in China has got something like $5 billion every year or every 2 years spent on research, and a huge amount of that is spent on language technology research. Google, Microsoft, Amazon put in similar amounts of money into research. All the researchers who previously worked at universities are now all working at those companies, you know, Amazon, Google, Alibaba, or whatever. And that changes things a bit. Like, one of it is that maybe in the future machine translation will greatly improve, but machine translation is being targeted for the big technology companies. It's not being targeted for, say, life science companies. So there will be a disparity. The other problem that I see is that you will have all these companies doing the same thing because they're competing with each other. They won't cooperate with each other. Some of them view this as their competitive edge. Like a couple of years ago, Google had an investor call, and a Google investor call is a major event where the top financial journalists are at it, and what they talked to them about was improvements in machine translation. And, you know, to me that's quite interesting, because probably the reason Google did that is that they hadn't got something more spectacular like a driverless car to show them. But it's funny that the biggest company in the world is talking to their most important audience, their investors, the people that essentially are their way to talk to their owners. And they're talking about translation, even if it's machine translation in a funny way. But it also shows how important this is to them. But I think it's interesting, but I think also that there will be problems in the future. And the two problems I see is that a whole pile of companies are spending money and they're doing the same thing. And secondly, it will all be focused on a certain sector, on the high technology sector. And there won't be so much research done into how to improve machine translation, for example, for life science companies or for smaller industries or whatever. Yeah, again, with voice recognition and translation is quite interesting, because until the 1980s, what happened with translation is that somebody would become a translator, they would buy a dictaphone, and they would have maybe one or two secretaries working with them. And, you know, the translator would just talk through the dictaphone, and the secretaries would type. And then the computer came in, and that changed everything. And what happened is that translators who were doing 5,000 to 6,000 words a day were now doing 2,000 words a day in the name of progress. And it wasn't until technology, voice recognition technology and computers caught up with the previous model that this started happening again. And it's very interesting with voice technology, because we've got a lot of people that use it, but it's not young people who you expect to be adapted, using voice recognition technology. The people that we see using it and getting an awful, using it very effectively, or some of the translators have got 40 years experience. There's one man who translates, doesn't have a keyboard on his computer, it's just some sort of, mouse and games setup that he's got. He uses voice recognition all the time. He's one of the best paid translators in Germany. He's about 60 years old and has been doing this for a long time. And the interesting thing with him is that he does about 4,000 or 5,000 words per day. He could do more, and they'll all be expensive words, because he's the person that if you've got a court case in Germany over, say, an English to German patent infringement, he would be the expert witness that you bring. And I'm sure he's not cheap to do translation. The fact that he's doing that amount of words is phenomenal. And the interesting thing is that from a translator's perspective, voice recognition could be even more important, or more productive than machine translation. The bad thing is that from your perspective is that the technology for this is so expensive that it's for a small number of countries. Slovakian, for example, is not covered. I think it's not. Is Slovakian in Siri on the iPhones? And this is the problem, because more and more of the things that we do now, voice is going to be used to interact with, with other devices. Like in countries like America, people go into their home and say, Siri, play music, or Alexa, or whoever is going to do this for them. And they'll get into the idea that how you input to a computer is through your voice. The keyboard is just another way to interact with the computer. But the problem that we've got here is that within professional voice recognition, it is good for languages like English, German, French, and so on. There are workarounds for about another 30 languages. Like, for example, we've got a tool in memoQ called memoQ that uses Siri uses the voice recognition in Siri. But for Slovakian, it's a big problem. And it will be a problem with other things because voice recognition is becoming more and more widely used. And in smaller languages, what do you do? I'm going to talk more about some of the older things within a translation tool like memoQ. And I'm going to start by talking about leveraging. I mentioned when I talked about MT that translation memory came from MT. What translation memory essentially is when a translator has translated the text, they mark the segments as source and target and store it in a database. And what happens is the tools have got smarter and smarter as that goes on, and they're able to figure out a whole pile of things, like they're able to match that. If you put this segment here and this segment here, maybe that's close to what the segment to be translated is. And they're able to do searching within the segments to get you more and more information. Most translation memories are segment-based, where they're essentially a database of pairs. One of the things that I think is more interesting is when you just match the whole document and you have a corpus-based memory. And we've got this with a set of tools we've called live docs. And one of the things you can do, if you come to the course tomorrow, I'll show you the alignment with live docs. But this allows us to do things like to align documents very quickly. It also allows us to, if you haven't got you haven't got an aligned document, but you do have a reference document, it allows you to do concordant searching within the reference document, so you can still find something that's relevant, even though you haven't got what was traditionally called a memory. And that sort of thing is quite useful. Machine translation I've mentioned. Terminology is obviously quite crucial here. And again, with terminology, not just our tool, but all our competitors' tools have got smarter and smarter with how we use that. And some of the things the tools can do are like match what's in a translation memory and what's in a terminology, and create a different segment based on that. In our tool, and I think many of our competitors' tools, we can also do things like translate numbers automatically and have the correct format for the locale. Like if it's going from US to Slovakian, we would take out the commas for the thousands and the points for decimal points, and put in commas for decimal points, I think, and spaces for thousands. And the other thing that's quite interesting is subsegment leveraging. I'll talk to you about that in just a minute when I talk about audiovisual translation. Well, actually, I'm going to talk to you about it now. Subsegment leveraging, what it does is that when you translate a document, if you translate the same segment twice before in a document, in memoQ, it shows it to you automatically that this is what you had the last 2 times that came up. And this is becoming a more and more important issue because there's a lot of translators who are doing audio-visual translation. And what they have been doing is they've been working in subtitling tools. And they've been spending a lot of time looking at what they previously translated, trying to find it in where they know they translated that text before. It could be, for example, the name of something within a television program or whatever, and they have to get it to be so that it's consistent with the previous time. But in order to do that, they have to look through it. Well, in our tool, it just happens automatically, and this is technology that is 12 years old. You know, it's been, memoQ had this in 2008. Yeah, and I'm going to talk quickly about audio-visual translation. This is a stupid joke. How many translators take to change a light bulb? And the answer depends on the context. And one of the issues that audio-visual translators had is the preview. You know, how do you see the video in as they're translating? And what we've done is we've got a preview for video files. Part of the reason why translators were using the subtitling tools is the subtitling tools would show them the video, and they found that useful. But this is really a prerequisite for translators translating. What this does is that when you go, the same as a normal preview, when you move to the next segment, it adds the translated segment to the movie. Quality assurance is something that's quite important, and I'm going to finish by talking to you about this. Oh, and it tells me I'm finishing. Sorry. One of the things that our tool does, and I think most of our competitors' tools do this too, so it's not unusual to us, is automatically check the text for certain errors. You know, what we do is we check for things like, has the text been translated? Is there blank, you know, or has something not been translated? Is the target and source text the same? Is the number formats wrong? Is currency put in wrong? Like if, and all of that sort of things are things that we check automatically. And again, this is something that's old technology, but very, very useful. And if you as a translator can get this right, where you're just seeing the errors that match you, you know, anything that you don't want to see, you get rid of, then it makes life very, very very easy, because at the end of the, you know, your translating session, you just run a QA and it comes up with a grid, click on it and you can resolve it. Or if you see something which is a false positive, you just ignore it in every instance. And it's very simple technology. It's been around a long time, but it should be used because it could make people's lives much easier. So I've come to the end of this presentation. If there's questions or...
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not using your software because I have a Mac computer. So my question is, do you have any plans to introduce it for Apple computers?
Well, people are using memoQ on virtual machines on a Mac, which isn't the right answer. We're constantly improving browser-based versions of memoQ, and the way everything's going is that the browser version will be as good or better, but it takes time. It's not a simple thing. So, you know,
I think that the workshops tomorrow will provide also a good venue for discussing practical issues, and as I'm informed, they're quite filled, but please check the tickets if you would like to attend the workshops. Some tickets have just been opened because I've received emails that some people have cancelled the tickets. So you can join the workshops, and I'm sure it's going to be very practical. So Thank you very much. I'm a great fan of memoQ. I love it, and I'm glad we had a chance to see the current trends and the possibilities of how this tool is evolving. And again, I'm really thankful for memoQ for having such a generous academic version, enabling us to work with it. So that's very helpful. Thank you very much.